Welcome back, everybody, to the Swolgaard podcast. This is episode 36, The Best of the Centuries. So today we're going to be talking about the impacts of economic, social, and political aspects of the country and which decades were the most influential during this time. So for our economic section, we have number 1, the 1930s, number 2, the 1920s, number 3, the 1870s, number 4, the 1950s, and number 5, the 1810s. Next is our social impacts. For number 1, we have the 1960s, number 2, the 1920s, number 3, the 1900s, number 4, the 1690s, and 5, the 1980s. Last but not least is our political section. Number 1, the 1780s, 2, the 1860s, 3, 1820s, 4, 2000s, and finally 5, 1910s. The most influential decade of the American economy was the 1930s. This period is widely known for the Great Depression, and yes, it is. When the Great Depression first began, Herbert Hoover was the president. Many people did not agree with Hoover's approach to the Great Depression because he did not like the use of government handouts to the American people. Instead of government handouts, Herbert Hoover implemented a public works system, which created many jobs for people and which built the famous Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. But many people still did not like his approach. So, in 1932, a new president was elected named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His approach to the Great Depression was very progressive. He implemented a program called the New Deal, which was a series of acts that the government created to combat economic depression in the 30s. Because of the New Deal and its fight against the Great Depression, the New Deal began the new pathway for the American economy, showing that the government might have to intervene with some economics in order to fight an economic depression. The second most influential decade of the economic American history is the 1920s. The 1920s was a very wealthy period. People began to take advantage of the stock market and began to get really wealthy off this new system. But they had one big problem. This problem was the use of buying on credit. Buying on credit means that they didn't actually have the money that they were using to buy new things, especially stocks in the stock market. They would use credit systems and use the credit to buy things that they couldn't afford, making them further in debt. This led to the crash of the stock market, which is called Black Tuesday. This happened on October 29th, 1929, when 16,410,030 shares of stock were sold in a single day. Because people would buy these stocks on credit, they didn't have enough money to regain their amount of money that they lost, so they went further into debt. This led to a giant crash on the American economy, as many people began losing jobs as companies would crash. This led to what was known as the Great Depression earlier in the slideshow, and destroyed the American economy for the time being. Next up, we have the 1870s. This time was nicknamed the Gilded Age in 1873 by Mark Twain to show how it may have seemed shiny on the outside, but inside it was corrupt and evil. These companies are called monopolies that control smaller companies so that they can control the whole marketplace. An example of a big monopoly that was created in the 1870s was the Standard Oil Company. This monopoly was created by John D. Rockefeller, and controlled all the oil output in the U.S. You see, this monopoly was crushing the smaller companies, the oil companies. So the government had to put an end to this. The government didn't really touch the monopolies until the 1890s with the Sherman antitrust law, but that wasn't in the 1870s, so we're not going to touch that right now. But we're going to move on to the Panic of 1873. This depression was actually called the Great Depression by Americans before the Great Depression that we now know occurred in 1930. This depression was created by the overproducing of objects, especially agricultural crops in America. So as crops would be produced, there wouldn't be the demand to buy them. So people weren't making any profit off of the crops or the goods that they were selling, leading to higher debts and less people having a job. This Panic of 1873 was actually a leading factor that showed the corruption in the 1870s of the economics of America. Number 4 on the economic scale is the 1950s. The 1950s was an interesting time because it was after the Great Depression and World War II. So America had just gone through two major, devastating catastrophes. So they were ready to rebound with a new economy. And what was produced was the economy of the 1950s. Because of World War II, the World War II contributed to the end of the Great Depression and helped America regain jobs in America. So as the war stopped and people began to go back to normal, there were more jobs for women and minorities as well, and this really contributed to a leading economic factor in America and helped regain the modern economy that we have today. These post-war economics really contributed to the rise of consumerism. You see, as companies began to get more people into the workforce as the war ended, they began to produce more things and objects that Americans wanted, such as the refrigerator and more modernized cars. So America started to buy into these things and started to rise. There was a spike in consumerism because of this, and the modern stuff was totally invented and brought to the American doorstep. What happened after consumerism and during consumerism was really important. This was called the baby boom. As people began to have more modern objects and stuff, they began to be more comfortable with life. And there was a rise in the population as many people had more babies and children. And this really led to a rise in the economy as a greater population was produced in America. The next up, number 5, we have 1810. Now this was a really amazing time in the economy because America was still a brand new country. They were only about 20 to 30 years old during this time. Because they were so young, they got into a war really fast. This is the War of 1812. This war was super important to the economy because it showed that the first war in America led to a greater amount of defense spending in America. More than 3 times the normal spending in America was for defense during this time. And after this time, after the War of 1812, defense spending just kept going up because as America saw that they needed the protection, then they used the budget that they had, and still today, most of the budget of the American economy is defense spending. Because of the War of 1812, there began to become a new depression, economic depression in America. This was called the Panic of 1819, But as this is because another way of overproducing and overbanking in America. It's just that it just showed another flaw in the American economy, just because as America was brand new and they were still figuring things out in politics and their economy, they were finding out what worked and what didn't. During this time wasn't just economic downfalls. There's actually economic uprisings as well. An example of this is the Savannah American steamship in 1818. Now, this ship was the first steamship to cross the Atlantic Ocean. It went from America to England, and this was a great economic um uprising because it showed the rise in steam-powered engines, and which eventually led to the rise of factories powered by coal and just a greater rise in the American economy. Now let's move on to our social aspect of America. So the number one, we have the 1960s. Prior to the 1960s, America had a very conservative time period of the 1950s. It was after the war. There's a great deal of patriotism in America. But in the 1960s, there was a new rise in counterculture. This was called the Beat Movement. There was more rock and roll, just uh, different counter to the old way of living, the traditional way of living. Because of this counterculture uprising, there began to be more pushback to the normal ways of living. So during this time, there was the Vietnam War. Earlier, the Korean War, there wasn't any pushback to it because it was seen as a good moral thing to do to go fight communism in Asia. But in the Vietnam War, uh, Americans began to see more of the war because of the rise in television. That was a big aspect during this time. And as Americans began to see what was happening in Vietnam, the the counterculture began to take control, and there was big riots and protests, anti-war protests, because of this movement, and they were mostly rich college kids. Well, the poor blue collar kids would go fight in the war. These richer, wealthier college kids would protest, and this was just a sign of the new counterculture rising in America during the 60s. During the 1960s, there's also a rise in social justice and civil rights. This movement, starting with Rosa Parks and the bus boycott, and leading to Martin Luther King Jr., a pastor that had the "I Had a Dream" speech in the March on Washington. They just led to a greater knowledge and understanding of um, the civil rights movement during the 60s. And this was just a really big social time in America, showing how the modern norm of protesting and trying to have protests become the way to get social change in America. Number two on our list for social influence in America is the 1920s. Like the 1960s, there was a great rise in counterculture in the 1920s. People began to, especially the younger generation, began to fight back against the more traditional, older way of living, and began to think of life as being more modernized during this time. As this happened, there began to be a new change in fashion as well. This is where you see the rise of the flappers, which was very immoral and very against traditional way of dressing, as many people would not wear the traditional long dresses, and they began to just go against the traditional normal in America. One great aspect that kind of led to the change in counterculture was the rise of wealth in America and the rise of wealthier people. As wealth rose, many people began to change their style of living drastically from being very poor to becoming very rich. And as they did this, many people began to see that they could look rich in their way of dressing. So even though they might have been poor, they were accepted in society because of their fashion. Number 3 on the list is the 1900s. Now, this was a big change, social change in America, because it showed the rise of progressivism. Starting in 1901, when Teddy Roosevelt was elected, progressivism began to become a big topic in America. In Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal, as he started laying out many progressive topics of conservationism, consumer protection, and the breaking of the trusts and monopolies. Another sign of progressivism that contributed to the rise of progressivism was the rise of populism. This rise of populism was similar to progressivism. It's just that it related more to the rural farmers out into the Midwest and how they wanted to use populism to benefit themselves and their way of life and earning money. Another sign in the rise of progressivism was the creation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, in 1909. This just showed that the modern fight for civil rights and the civil rights movement and how progressivism contributed to that and to the society within America. Next up, we have the 1690s. Now, this was a really amazing time period for society. So, during this time, there was the Salem witch trials, and these trials were a sign of counterculture in America and how people who challenged the traditional normal in America would be punished severely. And as leaders, in colonial leaders, would see this rise in counterculture, they would punish these innocent people and call them witches, just showing the rise in counterculture and the backlash of traditional society. Another thing that we see concerning society during this time is the discrimination based on religion in the American colonies. This was a big major factor in the creation of many of the colonies. For example, Roger Williams and the creation of Rhode Island. But that was back in 1636. But this was still happening in the 1690s, as many people were not allowed to become in government because of their religion. Another big society change was the first college in America. This was the College of William and Mary, founded in 1693. This was a giant advancement in America because it showed that the American colonies were becoming a real established place and that they thrived on education in the colonies and wanted to educate the citizens of America. This just showed that it was a great time for education during the 1690s. Number 5 on our social change list is the 1980s. So this was when Reagan was the president of the United States. Before Reagan, it was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter being a more liberal president, and Reagan being a very conservative president, showed the change, the shift in America social and political spectrum during this time. Uh, this also showed the rise of neoconservatism. Neoconservatism was the uprising of new conservatives. These conservatives being more anti-federal government and more uh, basic human rights. And these rights, they were very pro-Constitution and Bill of Rights, and they wanted to have a change in government. So during this time, there was also the rise of the silent majority. The silent majority were the normal Americans, mostly middle class and working class Americans, that wanted the change back to the traditional values that America used to have. And these values were more family oriented and more of a moral being. So this was way after, not way after, but about 20 years after, 10 to 20 years after the counterculture system of the 60s. So as many people saw what happened in the 60s, they wanted to change back to the conservative ways. And this also represented how modern America society is, basically how the government is a little more conservative with their policies. For our first decade on the list of political aspects in America is the 1780s. So the 1780s is probably the most important decade in all of American history, just because it really was the birth of our country and our freedoms. This is when our Constitution was written and ratified by the states. This Constitution is the piece of legislative document that we still have today and are still implemented. This Constitution is very important to our freedom and our political aspects in America. First of all, it separates the three branches of government and creates an equal balance of power, making it perfect for the system of government that we have today. The Constitution is our just written. It's what all of our judiciary branches use and how to solve problems. But this isn't all. One of the other most important parts of the Constitution is the Bill of Rights. When this was passed, it was a compromise between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, because the Federalists wanted a strong central government. They wanted and supported the Constitution, but they needed to get support from the Anti-Federalists, who wanted the Articles of Confederation, which were very pro-small government. And in order to do this, they created the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is basically the list of all the freedoms that we have in America today, our founding and most important freedoms that we have. Without the Bill of Rights, there would be no freedom in America, and America wouldn't be America. But the Bill of Rights is really, really like awesome in the way we govern our country and on the political spectrum. It also set up, the Constitution also set up the creation of the presidency. This is another aspect of the 1780s, is the election of George Washington. George Washington, being our first American president, was one of the major founding fathers of our country. Because of George Washington, he kind of laid out what a president is supposed to do and how he supports the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and all of our freedoms that we have in America. This also, being a brand new country, George Washington governed our country correctly, and laid out how future presidents were supposed to govern our country today. The second most influential political decade in America was the 1860s. Starting off with Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860 really set the stage for the upcoming Civil War. But let's focus on the election right now. This election was very crucial to the time because it showed, as the issue of slavery was heating up in America, the South especially wanted to know where their government stood on the issue of slavery. As Lincoln was elected with no Southern support, the South was very upset in the way they felt like they had no voice in electing a president at the time. So as a result, um, they seceded from the Union, starting with South Carolina, and the Civil War began. The Civil War being the first and the only Civil War that has occurred in America was a very crucial part of the creation of a modern democracy that we have today. So, because the South seceded from the Union, the Union really did want them back into the Union. So, as a result, Congress declared war on the rebelling South and tried to put an end to their revolution. And as a result, the fighting began. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, this is when the Civil War really began, a slavery issue, as the North was really putting out that their motive was to abolish slavery. As this occurred, the fighting eventually ended and Reconstruction began. The 1860s was also the era of Reconstruction, which also showed how modern American politics were shaping up as America began to become more focused on civil rights, leading to the modern civil rights movements. Reconstruction was very divided between the North and the South, and they really needed to learn to work together. As Lincoln addressed his solution to uniting the country again, it didn't punish the South at all, and many radical Republicans really wanted to punish the South. But this was a symbol of the political unity in America that Lincoln was trying to uphold. Number 3 on our political analysis is the 1820s. This time period was, of course, after the War of 1812, which was the first war that America had when they were a country. And because of this, America's foreign diplomacy changed greatly, starting with the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was a doctrine, a declaration to European countries that European countries should not become involved with expansionism in the Western Hemisphere, and that America, both South America and North America, needed to be governed itself, and if it happened, America would take control of this situation. Because of this, America had more land to itself, and because of this, the Manifest Destiny began to become popular in America. This idea was a statement that was produced that clearly stated that it was uh, America's job to expand west and to take control of the land because they were supposed to, and that was their mission. This this also rose to the way of modern expansionism that we have today, based on for example, the Louisiana Purchase was a result of uh, this expansionism, and as a result, we have the states of California and all the states to the west. And because of this expansionism, the Monroe Doctrine helped prevent the use of Britain and France and Spain within America anymore. And this led to more foreign involvement within South America rather than Europe on American soil. Number 4 on our list is the 2000s. So the 2000s actually began with a political problem and a challenge to uh, how America's government is set up. This was because of the 2000 election with Bush versus Gore. So this election was very close, and this really challenged the electoral college system on how Bush narrowly won by the Florida electoral college vote. Many people protested this way of voting, and one of the earlier modern pushbacks to the electoral college. Another thing that happened in the 2000s was the 9/11 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. This really challenged American democracy and American domestic relationships with other countries. This was one of the major terrorist attacks that have happened on American soil, and the government really saw a need for change in political government and the way Americans lived their life. As a result of this terrorist attack, Bush passed the Patriot Act. This act was very controversial because it basically gave the government permission to control a citizen's privacy within their cell phones and their technology. And so many people opposed this because they felt like their free speech and their privacy was being inhibited, and that the government was actually taking away their right. This was a big change in America because it showed a political change, because it showed how how the government began to grow stronger and stronger because of something that happened in America, and this trend became very marginalized in America, and how when there was something big that happened, as a result, the U.S. government would begin to infringe on citizens' rights and pass things contrary to the Bill of Rights. Number 5 on our political list is the 1910s. All right, so this decade is very important because of American progressivism in the government at this time. So Woodrow Wilson is elected in 1913, and he is a very progressive president. He changes many things to become more progressive in the government, changing from a more conservative government from President McKinley, and starting to become more progressive with Teddy Roosevelt. But as Wilson becomes in office, the government becomes very progressive. Some of these progressive acts that he passed, an example of this was the Federal Reserve Act. This act really changed the politics of America because it established a national currency for America, just a set national currency and a set national banking system. This is very progressive because it showed how the government now can change can can change inflation and enforce inflation, and how that really gave a ton of power to the government and not to private banking and industry, because as the government has the power to change inflation, they also have the power to change wealth in everybody's life. And many people saw this as very disturbing, but as the progressives did this, they thought it was very, very progressive. And another example is the 16th Amendment. The 16th Amendment established income tax. This was a very another progressive move and victory to the Democratic Party and to Woodrow Wilson, because this established how the government could enforce new taxes. Many Republicans didn't like this because of the way they thought big government was infringing on their rights, and like the Federal Reserve Act, they on their wealth and their banking. And many people just didn't like this, but as this was passed, the income tax became a new normal, and it just showed how the government had more power in your pockets. Now it's time for the big three. Number one, the 1780s. Now, this time period is the most influential decade of all of American history. Most importantly, it was the end of the Revolutionary War. This war was seen as a war that America could not win. Just a British army was so much stronger than America, and that it seemed like America did not have a chance. A little militia versus a huge world power. Yeah, none of the world thought so. But America proved everybody wrong that when they won that war. And that war was so impactful because it really was the creation of America. And as the British started to recognize America as an independent country, the world began to recognize America as an independent country. And because of this, America became a superpower in the world. After they won the Revolutionary War, the Articles of Confederation were ratified by all the states. It was the final ratification. This was super important because it was really the first written constitution in America. America at this time was scared of a big government, so this Articles of Confederation really gave power to the states and took away most of the power from the federal government. But as the articles began to become a big problem, as as the government couldn't tax its citizens or raise an army, America began to become weak in its own homeland. So they decided to create a new constitution. Now, this constitution was full of compromises. For example, the compromise of the Three-Fifths Compromise, that was a compromise of between the North and the South, and how the South would get 3/5 of a slave as counts as a person, and this was a compromise. And another compromise is the compromise of the Senate and the House of Representatives. It evened out the little states and the big states and made them equal, but at the same time, it gave power to the most populated states. These compromises were super impactful because as the Constitutional Congress compromised, it would really lead to a modern compromise, a modern day compromise, as they saw that these compromises would actually help America. So the House and the Senate was very influential on how minor states would not be passed over. Flyover states would not just be flown over and not recognize that everyone had a voice in America. And this time period, the 1780s, was just super duper duper impactful in the lives of so many Americans and today. Number 2 on our big 3 list is the 1860s. Now, the 1860s was super important because of the Civil War. This was really the turning point in American politics, social life, and economy. Like this, because America was split for a number of years, America learned that we really needed to be unified in order to run the country, in order to live life with freedom and liberty. And because of the Civil War, we led to more freedoms, especially to social civil rights movement, and all leading to the Reconstruction. And throughout Reconstruction, America actually became to be more unified as the North and South learned that they needed to work together in order to become a more perfect union, as the preamble of the Constitution says, and that this Reconstruction era was really impactful in the lives of every American because it showed the struggle of Reconstruction was real. And another super impactful moment in the 1860s was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. This was the first assassination of a U.S. president, so this was really big news at the time. And it came only a couple days after the South actually surrendered General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. And John Wilkes Booth, he assassinated Lincoln. And this just showed that as the Civil War ended, America still wasn't unified. So they had to go through the Reconstruction process and start to live together again in order to become unified. And this is just really important to the creation of modern America. So the last decade on our big 3 list is the 1930s. So the 1930s really started out in the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the beginning of the 1930s. This was super impactful in the economic and political spectrum of America because as the Great Depression really changed how Americans saw credit and banking, and how America had to shift from the newly created buying on credit to understanding the impacts. So when the stock market crashed and so many people lost their jobs, they realized that they really needed to have a backup and how the government needed to help. And so this is when the New Deal comes in. So FDR is elected, and in his first 100 days, he begins the New Deal. And so during this time, there was a lot of propaganda that was put out to support New Deal programs. This really impacted America because propaganda was really only seen in communist Russia and many other communist countries. So as FDR got elected and he started using propaganda, it really shifted from super traditional conservative American values to more progressive almost socialist communist values as FDR started to put out his New Deal programs. This really changed Americans' reliance on big government as Americans began to get used to government handouts and government programs. They began to almost become bribed with these programs that FDR has put out, and that society actually won't go back to what there used to be in the New Deal. And so this really changed how a modern America, because before the Great Depression occurred, we were still living the traditional conservative lifestyle of Americans. And after this really sped up how America was becoming more and more modernized. And another deal, as the New Deal came to a close and World War II began to heat up in Europe, America became more isolated. FDR put out the statement of isolation, and this really had a turning point in American foreign diplomacy, and how, as America was isolated from the war, they really changed how they thought of the war. But as the war raged on, they began to become closer and closer to joining the war, and eventually in 1941 they joined the war. But the 1930s was a very influential time as it changed the economic, social, and political spectrum of America, especially how Americans see their government today. Alright guys, this has been another awesome episode of the Isaac Swolgaard podcast. It's been the best of the centuries. Thank you so much for watching.